So, I will be talking about health hormones and longevity tonight and a science-backed approach to make you look and feel better for long. So the topic tonight is about health, hormones, and longevity, and it's kind of a trendy topic that a lot of people are wondering what they should be doing. They can be very overwhelmed with all the information out there. There's so much talk about how can we extend our life? Do we need to take supplements? Do we need to take fancy infusions? What are certain things that we can do to optimize our health in the younger, earlier life already? Hormone issues in our 30s, 40s, and then going later into life into Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, dementia, all these scary cancer, those scary diagnoses. And we'll talk a little bit about the facts and the myth and what biology really says, what we can do on a day-to-day basis to really help improve that longevity. Okay, so what we're basically trying to achieve is, you can see here we have lifespan, and that's what science has been wonderful at achieving, getting that longer over the last century. We're all getting older, we're living longer, but that doesn't necessarily come with better health and longer health throughout the older years. So oftentimes we get older, but then it's very common that people have cardiovascular disease, cholesterol starts creeping up, their blood pressure starts creeping up, and they're just not feeling that well. And the whole idea about longevity is that we, instead of just living longer, is that we try and extend that health span so we feel better into older ages. And part of feeling better is not just feeling better physically, but also emotionally, so that we feel stronger and happier. And there's a lot of research that shows us what we can do to support that. Now, these are some of the common symptoms. There are many more that basically take away that quality of life and reduce that health span and make it kind of miserable getting older in a way. And that can start earlier on in life with period pains or losing hair, hot flashes through menopause, headaches, joint aches, and then longer and later in life, the more serious symptoms like cardiovascular disease, dementia, being frail, osteoporosis, those kinds of things. And some of the most common solutions is if you go to a doctor and you have certain symptoms, they'll give you certain drugs to take away the symptoms, which is life-saving and very important in most situations. But oftentimes they don't really look at the underlying triggers because they just don't have the time for it most often. So some of the drugs they help with one thing that might give side effects on the long run somewhere else. So the way functional medicine works is to actually look at what is actually causing these symptoms, what are the underlying triggers, so that we then don't have to, we can take all these different drugs. It's very important to actually do all of these things when they're necessary, but then at the same time, look at what's triggering it. And there's this new research called geroscience that is actually really fascinating. It's coming out of the States, a lot done in Silicon Valley actually, and it's the science of aging. And what they found is that a lot of these that we used to think as very separate illnesses like Parkinson's and heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, and we would give very specific drugs to treat the different symptoms and conditions, they found that there are underlying factors that underlie most of these issues, and not just in the old age, but those same underlying factors also usually contribute to symptoms in the earlier ages, in the 30s and the 40s, hormone issues, and they all interconnect and talk to each other. And you can, if you address them, then you can slow aging as a whole. One of the big ones that people often talk about is inflammation. It's gotten a lot of press, or gut dysbiosis, so issues with the gut microbiome. A lot of people know about the importance of that now. And there are other factors as well, like when our DNA starts to not work so well anymore. If our cells don't replicate so well, then all of a sudden the sludge starts to build up, and then downstream that can contribute to all these issues, from Alzheimer's to strokes, heart attacks, but also, like I said before, earlier on in life, perimenopause issues, fertility issues, headaches. All these things have underlying factors that if we address them, then they can help with long-term health and optimizing. Now, what this does, and I took this just from a research paper, I didn't draw this myself, this basically helps us make that health span longer so that we live longer without any disease and basically have a better quality of life. And that's what longevity really stands for, living longer with better quality of life. Now, what a lot of the research in the geroscience and the longevity research then looks at is to develop drugs, obviously wonderful, lots of money in that as well, to suppress inflammation, to suppress these underlying hallmarks of aging, they call them. But often these drugs might have side effects, and also they might just block one single pathway. And they are very important for certain people if they already have issues. But what functional medicine does, and what I'll be talking about today, is to say, okay, what are the underlying triggers for that inflammation, for all of these issues to develop in the first place? And if we can work on that and optimize that, then maybe we don't need all these drugs, or we can reduce we might not need as much of them. Okay, and that's where functional medicine comes into play. So functional medicine, I don't know who of you today knows a little bit about it. It's basically a root cause approach. It goes hand in hand with conventional medicine. So like I said in the beginning, all the drugs, very important. Just make functional medicine as an add-on to look at what's actually triggering it. Why did the person develop a problem in the first place? And let's work on those underlying factors. And perhaps if we take away those imbalances and support the system, perhaps the person then can heal and maybe needs less of these drugs. Okay, so you might be thinking, why does this even matter? Isn't all my health set in my genes? My mother has Alzheimer's, or my grandmother has breast cancer. I will have the same issue. Now, there's actually this wonderful science called epigenetics that has come into, has a lot more focus in research over the past decade and more. And it's called epigenetics around our genes. And what they found is really fascinating, that our genes, they just decide where we have certain weaknesses, but then it's our epigenetics, everything around us, our lifestyle, our diet, our stress levels, toxins, they decide whether that gene gets turned on or off. So we might have certain genes. They found that some people with Alzheimer's genes, they might not actually turn that on and never have issues. And other people that don't have the Alzheimer's gene, they still develop it because they're doing all the quote unquote wrong things. So that's very empowering. They also did a lot of twin studies where they take twins and they put them into different environments, and the identical twins with the same DNA, and they found that depending on their surroundings, they have different health outcomes. So our genes can give us certain weaknesses and predispositions, but they don't have to be our destiny. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the functional medicine side of it, getting to the root, what's really underneath those issues. So I showed this image before of all these different, they call them hallmarks of aging in science. They're 12 at the moment. And things like inflammation, damage to our mitochondria, our DNA. And we will be looking at what's actually causing those things so that we can then day to day address them and prevent these things from happening. The way I look at a human body is maybe a little mechanical, but I always picture it as lots of cogwheels that if they run smoothly, then everything runs smoothly. Then our brain functions, we have healthy mood, we're not anxious, our gut works, our hormones are happy, our immune system works well. But if there's slowly little bits of sand falling in there, or sludge or rust, then it doesn't right away grind to a halt, but it gradually will stop working as smoothly. So then eventually there's not one thing that will cause a problem, but it will be all these little factors that build up, and then things don't work as well anymore. And that's what we're looking at today. These little factors that might be tiny, but if they build up, then the whole system will stop working as well. So one of the big ones that can make this whole cogwheel machinery not work well anymore and contribute to aging, like I said before, is inflammation. Inflammation has become quite trendy, and for a good reason, because it really is at the root of a lot of issues in the body. And that can be, as in early life, things like acne, PCOS, endometriosis, but also depression, anxiety, vain things like belly fat, joint aches, trouble sleeping. Research shows that all of them have an underlying inflammatory component to them. And then when we're talking about aging and getting older, they even call inflammation inflammaging, because all the age-related diseases like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, but also other serious conditions like autoimmune conditions, cancers, they have all been linked to and shown to have an underlying factor of inflammation that's driving them. And it just causes all cause morbidity and just not feeling so well, reduced quality of life. Now, we might be thinking, where is this inflammation coming from? And inflammation, actually, it's kind of got a bad press because everyone thinks inflammation is only bad, but we need inflammation. It has a function in the body. It's our immune system getting rid of infections and invaders, healing cuts. So it's actually a really important process. It only turns into a problem if it then doesn't stop when the body has, when the infection has gone away or when the cut has healed. And if it starts to be that chronic low-grade inflammation, that's when it starts to create that rusting of that cogwheel machinery of health. And then wherever we have our predisposition, our weakness, that's where we then develop symptoms. And some of the underlying triggers can be chronic infections, and people have heard a lot about the gut microbiome. So these bacteria, we all have bacteria in the gut, and we need to have good bacteria in there that keep the gut lining really nice and strong and healthy. Now, if we have an overgrowth of some bad ones, or we don't have enough of the good ones in there, then the gut becomes permeable. They call it leaky gut in layman terms as well, but there's actually research that shows it becomes a little bit more permeable. And then all of a sudden, substances from the gut can go into the bloodstream at a different shape. And then the immune system thinks it's being attacked by an invader and will try and fight it off, causing inflammation. So oftentimes this can be chronic infections that cause these issues. It can be fungal infections like Candida albicans. It can be mold around us that also causes all of that not to work so well. But it can also be that when we've developed this imbalance in the gut, that all of a sudden healthy foods like avocados or almonds can get into the bloodstream at a different shape. And then the immune system thinks it's an invader and will attack it and will produce memory cells. So every time you're eating that healthy food, example, avocados or almonds, it might, if it has decided it looks like a virus or an invader, it will produce inflammation to fight it off. And so those are hidden food intolerances that I quite frequently see in my patients with chronic issues. They might be thinking they're doing everything right, but if they've had a gut issue for a while, they would have likely developed some food intolerances that will constantly cause inflammation in the body. Also, not enough omega-3s. People have heard a lot about omega-3s, but it's actually that important. So we all have inflammation, like I said, but we need to then be able to stop it when it's done its job. And omega-3s from fish oil, for example, is needed for that process to stop it. It's called resolution. Without that, the inflammation just keeps going. And then there's other factors like overeating, processed foods, lots of sugars, having lots of blood sugar spikes and dips, synthetic foods, pollution. They can all also trigger inflammation in the body. Basically anything that the body doesn't recognize, it thinks it's being attacked and it causes inflammation. The next really big underlying trigger for these hallmarks of aging that cause all sorts of health issues that we don't want to have are blood sugar spikes and dips. Now, there's a lot of it's also become trendy because of Zoe, because of the blood sugar monitors that people use, and there's a lot of research now. People realize that it's important to balance your blood sugar. Now, back when I started this 10 years ago, people weren't so aware of it yet, and it was kind of normal, it still is not sometimes now in certain circles, that people get hangry. They get so they say, oh, I'm hangry, I'm so hungry that I'm really moody and angry and don't come anywhere near me. It's almost like an acceptable thing in society. People get really moody and angry, but actually it means that there was a blood sugar spike that then caused a dip after, and that then the body thinks it's starving and it needs food. That's not what we want to have. We don't want these blood sugar roller coasters. We want the blood sugar, you can see that green line here, we want that to stay nice and steady throughout the day, throughout the night. If we have a dip at night, it can wake us up. If we have a spike during the day, it constantly causes micro damage to our cells. For example, every time we have a blood sugar spike, it attaches to our cells, our body is mostly made out of protein and fats, and then it irreversibly attaches itself to these cells and causes something called advanced glycation end products. And the short word for that is ages. So it basically ages us from the inside out. And those ages, they don't just go away. They needs to wait until the body's recycling them, and that can take a long time. So we build up these age-related factors in the body, making us basically rust from the inside if we have lots and lots of blood sugar spikes. They can contribute to wrinkles, but it can also contribute to more serious things, like I wrote here, this metabolic syndrome, where we start to accumulate weight around the waist. That I often see it in, I get a lot of skinny fat patients, people that come in, they've got skinny legs, skinny arms, but they've just got that layer of belly fat around their middle. And that actually comes from partly from a lot of these blood sugar spikes, so that the body stops responding to those sugar spikes and becomes insulin resistant eventually. And that has then been linked to all these ill health effects. Dementia, cancers, but also in the short term, PCOS and acne, endometriosis, hormone issues that often affect people at a younger age already, leading into perimenopause as well. They found that a lot of the hot flashes during perimenopause, for example, are actually not just caused by hormones, but also blood sugar spikes that then make the body produce more adrenaline, and then they get these hot flashes. So that's another really important underlying factor that can be influenced. Another underlying factor that's very important is stress. People often kind of flippantly say, oh yeah, that person got sick because they went through a stressful period, but it actually is just like that. So when we're stressed, we normally have, this is a daily cortisol curve. So first thing in the morning, cortisol is one of our main stress hormones. We should have a nice spike of cortisol to wake us up, get everything going, get the immune system working, get us energized, and then it should taper off throughout the day so that at night we can get a nice restful sleep, because this red line here is melatonin, and that we need that to have a good restorative sleep. Now, what happens often is that people, if they're constantly, in particular in places like London, they're thinking they're running away from a tiger all day long. They're constantly in fight or flight mode. So instead of having a spike in the morning and then tapering off, that stays really elevated into the night. So then they're completely wired, but then they don't get good quality sleep because the cortisol is not doing the right things at night. So melatonin can't come in properly. They don't get a good quality sleep. So then they're wired, and then they caffeinate, and they just on that cycle of constantly pumping out too much cortisol. Now, what research shows that if we have too much cortisol, and there's a really important part to this, we want that cortisol in the morning to help our immune system. So they found that people with autoimmune disease and cancers and obesity, they actually don't have a spike in the morning. So that's not good either. We want that to be a spike in the morning, wake up, be energized, and then we want it to taper. If that stays elevated, it messes with the immune system, because basically the body in that moment thinks it's running away from a tiger. So it's sending all of the blood flow to the parts of the body that are needed to run away from that perceived tiger. And it's directing away all the energy and all the blood flow from the digestive organs, from the reproductive organs, because in that moment they think about survival and not about reproduction or digestion or healing. So basically, when we're in fight or flight, we can't also do all the restorative, nice things that we need to clean out the body and keep everything functioning smoothly. So there's just a few extracts from some research papers showing that stress reduces the function of that gut lining that I mentioned before, because the body is taking away the blood to other parts of the body to run away from a tiger and not keeping the gut nice and strong. And then that can contribute to autoimmune disorders or to inflammation. It's also been linked to the body then not being able to get rid of cancer cells as much. And we all have tiny cancer cells all the time. It's just our immune system needs to be able to clear them out. So every time we have too much cortisol too late in the day, our body just can't do its job properly. And if we keep on that trajectory for a long time, if we have a lot of stress all the time, then eventually the cortisol drops in the morning. And I see this in people that have burnout or have actual chronic illnesses, and they just don't get enough cortisol at all. And when we don't have it in the morning, then the body actually wants it, like I said before, and then it can also contribute to the immune system not able to get rid of, it's called immune surveillance, where the body gets rid of cancer cells. It allows something called immune escape, where it all of a sudden allows more of these cancer cells, infections to linger that the body usually takes care of. So it's actually very important. It also makes us, we have worse choices with food, for example, if we're stressed, because we trigger the reptilian part of the brain, our survival brain, that says eat, 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 no matter what it is. And it's really hard to stick to healthy choices. It messes with our sleep, like I said before. If we're having, let's say, this is a typical profile of someone, morning, no cortisol when it should have, and then they ramp themselves up throughout the day and push through it and get all wired. So then it gets high, and then it stays too high in the evening, and then they can't get a restful sleep. Now, sleep, I could do a whole hour lecture on just that, but sleep is really important for longevity and recovery, because for lots of reasons. But one of them is that at night when we're in deep sleep, our brain shrinks a little bit. And then we have this lymphatic system in the body that people usually know about. But we have a similar thing in the brain called lymphatic system, and it kind of showers through the brain. But the brain needs to shrink a little to really let that flush through the brain. And we all have mini toxins that build up through the day. It's a very natural process, a little bit of plaques, these amyloid plaques that we're so worried about for Alzheimer's. We just need to be able to flush through it and get rid of anything that's accumulated. And if we get good quality sleep, then the body can do its cleaning. It can restore, it can produce hormones. Testosterone is mostly produced during something called the REM type of sleep, that the sleep where we're dreaming. And so we need deep quality sleep to produce the right amounts of hormones, flush through the brain, and just restore and recover. Another thing that I just want to briefly touch upon, I know that today's lecture is called Hormones and Longevity in Health, so some of the people probably want to hear about hormones. I did this talk yesterday in a clinic in Marylebone, and the women all wanted to hear about hormones, and I didn't talk about it enough, but they didn't complain, but I will do a little more today about it. So oftentimes people think that symptoms like irregular periods as a teenager, having period pains, having hormonal acne, PCOS, painful breasts, maybe endometriosis, that is a nuisance, but not so much of a problem. But all of these have an hormonal imbalance underlying, and often also an inflammation. Now, if that lingers, they found that if these hormonal imbalances and inflammation stay for longer, then those women also have a harder time with perimenopause, transitioning, more hot flashes, more problems there. Let me just turn that off. But also they found that women that have more perimenopause issues, more severe hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms, they're called, they have a higher likelihood of having Alzheimer's and osteoporosis and things like that down the line, cardiovascular disease. So having imbalanced hormones now is maybe a nuisance, but we want to address them without worrying anyone, because none of this is just the one thing that will cause cancer or Alzheimer's, but we can just support and optimize things now so that we then can at least have the best shot at staying as healthy and functioning optimally the longer and the older we get. Part of it is in particular around that second part of the cycle has become, again, a lot of women hear on Instagram about how they should live and eat to support their cycle. And it is actually quite important because we have these different hormones. So for example, we have progesterone coming up in the second part of the cycle, and estrogen, this is the yellow line, should be a little bit lower in the second part. And often a lot of the problems that women have with painful breasts and heavy periods, endometriosis, breast cancers, they can have, as one of an underlying factor, it can be that they have too much estrogen in that second part of the cycle and not enough progesterone to balance it out. And if you address that, then that'll be good. If you don't address it long term, that can contribute to things like breast cancers, ovarian cancers. So you really want to deal with that when you can. And we'll talk about it in a moment. I'll give you some empowering steps you can start doing tomorrow. Okay, I just talked about what do hot flashes have to do with cardiovascular disease. PCOS early on is an inflammatory condition, and acne as well that can then lead to more of a propensity to hot flashes. Vaginal dryness is another topic. I think none of the people in this talk today are at that age yet, but when women get older, that can be a big issue. And they actually found that vaginal dryness as we get older can be partly due to not enough hormones, in particular estrogen, but also a vaginal microbiome imbalance. So I talked about the microbiome, the gut bacteria inside our gut, but we actually also have a microbiome in our vagina. And if that's out of balance, then can contribute to vaginal dryness. So it doesn't always just have to be hormones, needing hormone prescriptions, even though I'm all for bioidentical hormones when they're used properly. But sometimes it can just be checking what the microbiome is doing. Do we have enough of the right bacteria? Do we need to put in some more? Do we have an overgrowth of bad ones? And that can already help with a lot of these symptoms. Okay, another underlying factor for this cogwheel machinery of health to not work so well anymore is toxic load. Now, when we think back of the first few slides of the hallmarks of aging that they do a lot of research over in the States on that in particular, longevity research, one of them is free radical damage, these underlying factors that lead to all sorts of problems. Now, if we think about where does that free radical damage come from? They call it oxidative stress in medical terms. And those can be things like heavy metals. And obviously, we're sadly living in a fairly polluted world these days, so I don't want to stress anyone out, but it's about making little choices where we can without them stressing us out, and then the body can usually deal with a little bit of toxicity. It's just when it becomes too much that all of a sudden it's like this little fish bowl. This is a healthy fish, lots of nice clean water, and this is kind of a polluted water, and the fish becomes quite unhealthy and potentially dies. A common one, and I know that there's mostly women in this talk today, common one are all the cosmetics that we put on ourselves, all the products in our creams and in our skincare, hair dyes, our household products, the laundry detergents. They can all, and if it's just once in a while, it's not an issue. But if we constantly are bombarded by those synthetic chemicals, they can mimic hormones in our body. And the body doesn't know how to break them down because they aren't real hormones. So then it can cause damage inside the cells. And if that leads up, it causes issues. Pesticides are another one. You don't have to buy organic everything, but just the cleaner the food, the more natural, the better. So the body just recognizes it and knows what it is. And also synthetic foods and dyes. There's a lot of research showing that a lot of the synthetic colorings, they contribute to ADHD, for example. It's never one thing, it's always a combination of factors, but it can mess with our biology because the body just doesn't know what to do with these synthetic things. And also what we eat is really important. These are fancy little pictures from research papers I took from, but just to show you, when we eat certain foods, we decide whether these foods, either if we think about this cogwheel machinery again of health, either we pour in oil and everything runs much smoother, or we pour in sand and things it just doesn't work so well. So what we eat on a day-to-day basis decides how strong our gut microbiome is, whether we have good and healthy bacteria, low inflammation, strong immune system, or whether we are tipping towards a not so good one. Also, whether we're getting enough of the different nutrients that help certain processes in the body function well, to make the right chemicals, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, so that we just function properly and smoothly. And a lot has to do with our diet as well. So here, for example, they showed in a paper that having the wrong kind of gut bacteria, that can lead to and contribute to worsen Parkinson's disease, for example. So we do have some control over how we have a health outcome. If we just support things, we can have the best outcome possible, at least the best chance. Okay, so how does all of that have to do with longevity, aging, health span? I think it's quite clear, but all these things, if this biology doesn't work well, and I just told you about a few of the factors because we obviously only have limited time today. But if they don't function well, if there's constant blood sugar spikes and dips, if there's constant inflammation, free radical damage, then this cogwheel machinery of health will eventually just grind to a halt. And then wherever we have our weakness, we will have a really severe symptom. And so what we can do with functional medicine is to say, okay, let's just make things run as smooth as possible so we give our body the best chance at optimal health as possible.